Hello. They say the desert holds its secrets in silence. No blazing shootouts, no triumphant last stands, no swift justice under blazing suns. Just footsteps in dust, the quiet crackle of an empty campfire, and the hollow echo of boots walking toward nowhere. Tonight, we begin not with a bang, but with a breath. A long, slow inhale of desert air, thick with heat and memory. Welcome back to History for Sleep, where the legends lie down and the myths soften into murmur. Tonight, you are not a hero. You are not a villain. You are simply there, out on the trail, a long way from everything. And that is exactly where we find Billy the Kid, not as the outlaw of dime store novels or Hollywood Gunsmoke, but as a boy who waited more than he fought, who sat still more than he ran, who drifted, quietly, across a land that promised freedom, but rarely gave comfort. This is not the tale you've heard before. Because when you strip away the gunfire, the wanted posters, the puffed-up legends, what's left is something much slower and perhaps much sadder. Imagine the cold bite of the night settling into your clothes, a thin blanket pulled tighter as coyotes sing far off beyond the black. Your hands dirt under the nails, calloused from rains and rope rubbed together to chase a little warmth. No tent, no bed, just dirt and starlight. The fire pops, but it does not heat. Your belly stirs not with fear, but with hunger. You had beans yesterday, maybe jerky tomorrow, but not tonight. Somewhere, miles behind, there's a name they're shouting. Billy, the Kid, killer, thief, rebel. But none of those words matter out here. Because here, tonight, it's just you. And the waiting, that's what life was, more often than not, for Billy. Waiting for the law to come. Waiting for the next meal. Waiting for morning. Waiting for someone to trust. In this 2-hour journey, we invite you to drift with us through the quiet truths of Billy's world. Through the monotony, the chill, the endless dust that coated not only boots, but hearts. We'll begin by walking with him not into battle, but into tedium. A day in the life of someone who was always on the run, and never quite free. Then, we'll return to the boy behind the legend. Not the one with the gun drawn, but the one writing letters by candlelight, thinking about his mother or the life that might have been. We'll move through the shadows of culture and mystery rituals, beliefs, and superstitions that haunted the deserts more than any lawman. And finally, we'll lift the curtain on the elite, the well-fed, well-dressed class of the West who watched from balconies while Billy lay in dirt. And through it all, we will move slowly, calmly, as the desert winds do. So, whether your eyes are open wide or slowly growing heavier, let yourself lean back. Let your breath soften. You are safe here. No one's chasing. No one's hiding. Only drifting. Drifting back into a time where the truth was quieter than the myth. Where the days were longer, the nights colder, and the name Billy the Kid meant something far more human. So settle in, pull your blanket tighter, and begin the journey. Because tonight, we're not chasing legends. We're lying beside them. The road didn't hum, and it didn't welcome you. It stretched silent and dry like an old scar across the face of the earth, cracked, stubborn, and too long for any map to bother measuring. If you were Billy, or someone like him, the first thing you'd learn wasn't how to shoot or how to lie. It was how to walk. Mile after mile, hour after hour, sometimes with a destination, most times without. Just movement for the sake of movement. Because to stop was to invite questions. Or worse, company. Imagine now, you're standing just before dawn, wrapped in last night's wind, shoulders stiff from sleeping against a saddlebag. The fire's long gone cold, and your breath curls against the blue-gray air like faint smoke from a fading dream. The horizon isn't rising, it's waiting. Waiting for you to move toward it, and then keep moving once you do. Because out here, there's always more. The trail beneath your boots is not soft. It crunches and gives a little, but not in kindness. It crumbles like ash, lifts like dust, and clings to everything: your boots, your lashes, the folds of your neck. You wear it like a second skin, and it never leaves. The heat doesn't strike all at once. It creeps, slow and silent, like suspicion. First it warms your coat, then crawls under it. You strip the coat off, only to feel your shirt begin to soak through at the back, under the arms. Your hat doesn't shade as much as it used to. Its brim cracked on one side, the leather faded from too many hours beneath a sun that doesn't blink. Even in the morning it burns gently like a warning. You try not to think about how far you've come or how far's left. But that's the thing about walking. There's nothing else to do but think. And out here, thinking turns over like dry earth. Memories rise like dust and settle back into silence. Every step is a prayer. Not for peace, but for water. A trickle, a stream, a sign. But the signs lie. You follow a bird too long, and it leads you to nowhere. You chase green on the edge of your vision, and it turns out to be cactus skin. You dream of rivers while awake, only to find your mouth growing sticky, your tongue thick like cotton. And when you do find water, when luck, or grace, or just pure stubbornness brings you to it, it's never how you dreamed. The surface shimmers like hope, but the taste is metallic. Brackish, warm. Still, you drink. Because the road is long, and the sun is only halfway up. Now look at your feet. They're not the feet you were born with. They belong to a different creature. The nails are dark with dried earth. The soles are cracked, blistered in places you stopped caring to feel. You've wrapped them before scraps of shirt, bits of hide, but nothing holds for long. Everything wears down, eventually. The boots you wear aren't new. They once were. Now, they speak with every step, soft flaps, low groans, like tired men refusing to fall. You press onward not because you're strong, but because there's no one left to carry you. Sometimes, on the trail, you meet another drifter. A nod, a silence, maybe a shared fire, maybe not. And just like that, they're gone, two paths crossing like wind-blown threads. No names, no trust. Not because you're unfriendly, but because you know better. The desert does something to men. Not loudly, quietly, like sand in your pockets that wasn't there yesterday. It changes you not with revelation, but with erosion. You become smaller, quieter, stripped of the things that made you soft. Comfort, care, time. The desert teaches patience, not peace. You learn how to wait for shade, for night, for something other than this. The sun tells you when to pause. The moon, when to move again. Your mind plays tricks. You start counting your steps not aloud, but in the rhythm of your bones. 1, 2, 1, 2, pain-sharp throb. You think of songs, but forget the words. You hum without melody. You mutter. You forget your voice until you speak it again and wonder who's listening. And sometimes, you stop walking. Not because you're tired, but because you want to remember what stillness feels like. But stillness is dangerous. Stillness invites the heat. Stillness lets your thoughts get too loud. So you keep walking, because the dust is better than doubt. Billy the Kid walked more than he shot. Far more. He was not always on a horse. He was often on his feet, chasing hope, running from names, wandering not toward anything, but away. And the desert knew his name, even if the people didn't. It knew the way he moved, cautious, deliberate, quiet. It knew the shape of his silence. It knew how he paused on the edge of a bluff and stared out, not in wonder, but in weariness. He wasn't the only one. The Old West was filled with men who walked alone. Men with stories written not in newspapers, but in sand. They left no legacy but tracks, and even those vanished with the wind. They say you wouldn't last a day in the Wild West. And they're probably right. Not because of outlaws or bullets, but because of the dust, because of the silence, because of the walking, because of the weight of the sun and the weight of your own breath in your chest. So tonight, as you lie still, warm beneath a roof, you might feel a little dust in your throat. Not real, of course, but imagined. A whisper of a journey you didn't take. The scrape of boots across dry earth. The sun on your neck. The wind at your back. And the endless miles of nowhere stretching ahead. Don't worry, you're not alone. Even Billy had those moments, and far more than anyone will ever say. Rest easy now. Let the dust settle. We'll walk again, in time. But not yet. There's a silence that only arrives after sundown in the deserta. Silence that doesn't speak, doesn't echo, doesn't yield. It simply sits. Heavy, unapologetic, waiting. By day, the dust took your breath. But at night, the cold stole it entirely. And so the sun dips low behind the crooked mesas, behind the distant crumbling ridges, and you find yourself once more with nowhere to go and even less to return to. The light fades not like a switch, but like a slow forgetting. One moment you're squinting at the rocks in the distance, and the next, you can barely see your own hands. This is where Billy found himself most nights. Not behind a saloon door or in a barn loft, as stories suggest, but under nothing. No roof, no blanket worth the name, no four walls to trap heat. Only a sky so wide, it made you feel smaller than your own name. The campfire was ritual, not comfort. You'd bend low to gather kindling-tree brush, twigs that snapped like bones, sometimes dung if nothing else was near. And if you were lucky enough to have flint, and dry enough to strike it, a spark would catch. Not in triumph but in relief. You'd feed it slow. Protect it with your body like a newborn. Shield it from the desert wind that never really rested. But the fire was a trickster. It gave you light but withheld warmth. Its glow seemed generous at first, licking up toward the cold night sky like it wanted to fight off the dark. But after an hour, maybe two, it settled. It gave up. It shrank into embers and hissed as if annoyed to have ever been summoned. You pulled your coat tighter, if you had one, or your blanket thin, worn through, with more holes than memory. You tucked your knees close, pressed your chin down, tried to sleep upright, because to lie flat meant full exposure. The wind would trace you like a finger drawn across bare skin, and there were always sounds. Coyotes, sometimes distant, sometimes not. Their yips rose like drunk laughter, unsteady and cruel. You told yourself they weren't interested, that they only came for the weak, the dead, or the careless. But still, you kept your knife close, or your pistol, not for them, but for anyone else who might appear out of nowhere. You didn't sleep so much as doze. Eyes half closed, mind alert beneath the fog of fatigue. And the dreams you caught, if any, were shallow, broken things. Not images of peace, but of memory. Faces you hadn't seen in years. A mother who once stroked your hair. A town you left behind. The smell of bread. The sound of church bells. Echoes, not dreams. And then the cold would shake you again. Because the fire had died. Of course it had. There were never enough logs. Never enough time. So you sat up, rubbed your arms, maybe stirred the ashes with a stick, hoping something would reignite. Sometimes it did. Sometimes you gave up. You looked at the stars. You always looked at the stars. Not because they gave you answers, but because they didn't. Billy must have known that routine, over and over. The fire that failed. The silence too big for thought. The ache in your lower back from sleeping upright. The stones beneath you pressing into your ribs like truths you'd rather not acknowledge. His nights weren't filled with shootouts or saloons. They were filled with silence, waiting, the sound of boots scraping dirt as he rolled over again for the 100th time. If you were lucky, you had a horse nearby, something warm, something breathing. Sometimes it was tethered. Sometimes it wandered. Sometimes it was gone when you woke. And when you did wake, if you could call it waking, you didn't feel rested. You felt emptied. Like someone had come in the night and taken something from you, but left you breathing, just enough to keep walking. The morning didn't feel like rescue. It was just the other side of night. A little brighter, a little louder, but not better. You'd stand slowly, brush the dust from your trousers, stretch like a man who'd lived 2 lifetimes in 6 hours. You'd shake your boots before putting them on, not because of scorpions, though that was always possible, but because you wanted the illusion of control. Of safety, of routine, and once more, you'd begin again, a few steps from where you'd slept, toward nowhere in particular, toward the next patch of flat ground, toward another night beneath stars that watched, but never helped. It's funny how the stories never tell you about the cold. They talk about bullets, about the thrill of the chase, about the showdown at noon, but not the 2 a.m. shivering, not the numb fingers fumbling with buttons. Not the pain of teeth chattering while trying not to make sound. The cold was the great leveler. It didn't care if you were Billy the Kid or just another nameless drifter. It wrapped around you, seeped into your bones, stole the warmth your body fought to hold. And there was no victory against it, only endurance. You wouldn't last long out here, not because you're soft, but because humans were never meant to sleep this way. Not night after night, not without rest, not without touch. Not without safety. But Billy did. He did because he had to. Because there were more enemies behind than friends ahead. Because stopping too long in one place meant questions. And questions meant jail. Or worse. He may have been called the Kid, but he aged in those nights. Each night carved something new into his face. Not a wrinkle, but a weariness. Not a scar, but a shadow. And yet, Every night, he still lit the fire, still watched it flicker, still sat under the stars and let the silence have him. Because what choice did he have? So tonight, as your pillow cradles your head and your blankets hold you close, think for a moment of the fire that didn't warm, of the man who watched it die again and again, of the sky that never gave answers, only questions, and feel just for a breath the luxury of being still, being safe, being held, because Billy never had that. Not for long, not often, and never without fear. Let your room be his shelter tonight. Let your quiet be his peace. And may the cold stay far from your door. There's a silence that only arrives after sundown in the deserta. Silence that doesn't speak, doesn't echo, doesn't yield. It simply sits, heavy, unapologetic, waiting. By day, the dust took your breath. But at night, the cold stole it entirely. And so the sun dips low behind the crooked mesas, behind the distant crumbling ridges, and you find yourself once more with nowhere to go and even less to return to. The light fades not like a switch, but like a slow forgetting. One moment, you're squinting at the rocks in the distance, and the next, you can barely see your own hands. This is where Billy found himself most nights. Not behind a saloon door or in a barn loft as stories suggest, but under nothing. No roof, no blanket worth the name, no four walls to trap heat. Only a sky so wide it made you feel smaller than your own name. The campfire was ritual, not comfort. You'd bend low to gather kindling-tree brush, twigs that snapped like bones, sometimes dung if nothing else was near. And if you were lucky enough to have flint, and dry enough to strike it, a spark would catch, not in triumph but in relief. You'd feed it slow, protect it with your body like a newborn, shield it from the desert wind that never really rested. But the fire was a trickster. It gave you light but withheld warmth. Its glow seemed generous at first, licking up toward the cold night sky like it wanted to fight off the dark. But after an hour, maybe two, it settled. It gave up. It shrank into embers and hissed as if annoyed to have ever been summoned. You pulled your coat tighter, if you had one, or your blanket thin, worn through, with more holes than memory. You tucked your knees close, pressed your chin down, tried to sleep upright. Because to lie flat meant full exposure. The wind would trace you like a finger drawn across bare skin, and there were always sounds. Coyotes, sometimes distant, sometimes not. Their yips rose like drunk laughter, unsteady and cruel. You told yourself they weren't interested, that they only came for the weak, the dead, or the careless. But still, you kept your knife close, or your pistol, not for them, but for anyone else who might appear out of nowhere. You didn't sleep so much as doze, eyes half closed, mind alert beneath the fog of fatigue, and the dreams you caught, if any, were shallow, broken things. Not images of peace, but of memory. Faces you hadn't seen in years, a mother who once stroked your hair, a town you left behind, the smell of bread, the sound of church bells, echoes, not dreams. And then the cold would shake you again, because the fire had died. Of course it had. There were never enough logs, never enough time. So you sat up, rubbed your arms, maybe stirred the ashes with a stick, hoping something would reignite. Sometimes it did. Sometimes you gave up. You looked at the stars. You always looked at the stars. Not because they gave you answers, but because they didn't. Billy must have known that routine, over and over. The fire that failed, the silence too big for thought, the ache in your lower back from sleeping upright, the stones beneath you pressing into your ribs like truths you'd rather not acknowledge. His nights weren't filled with shootouts or saloons. They were filled with silence, waiting, the sound of boots scraping dirt as he rolled over again for the 100th time. If you were lucky, you had a horse nearby, something warm, something breathing. Sometimes it was tethered, sometimes it wandered, sometimes it was gone when you woke. And when you did wake, if you could call it waking, you didn't feel rested. You felt emptied, like someone had come in the night and taken something from you, but left you breathing, just enough to keep walking. The morning didn't feel like rescue. It was just the other side of night, a little brighter, a little louder, but not better. You'd stand slowly, brush the dust from your trousers, stretch like a man who'd lived 2 lifetimes in 6 hours. You'd shake your boots before putting them on, not because of scorpions, though that was always possible, but because you wanted the illusion of control, of safety, of routine. And once more, you'd begin again, A few steps from where you'd slept, toward nowhere in particular, toward the next patch of flat ground, toward another night beneath stars that watched, but never helped. It's funny how the stories never tell you about the cold. They talk about bullets, about the thrill of the chase, about the showdown at noon, but not the 2 a.m. shivering. Not the numb fingers fumbling with buttons. Not the pain of teeth chattering while trying not to make sound. The cold was the great leveler. It didn't care if you were Billy the Kid or just another nameless drifter. It wrapped around you, seeped into your bones, stole the warmth your body fought to hold. And there was no victory against it, only endurance. You wouldn't last long out here, not because you're soft, but because humans were never meant to sleep this way. Not night after night, not without rest, not without touch, not without safety. But Billy did. He did because he had to, because there were more enemies behind than friends ahead, because stopping too long in one place meant questions, and questions meant jail, or worse. He may have been called the Kid, but he aged in those nights. Each night carved something new into his face, not a wrinkle, but a weariness, not a scar, but a shadow. And yet, every night, he still lit the fire, still watched it flicker, still sat under the stars and let the silence have him. Because what choice did he have? So tonight, as your pillow cradles your head and your blankets hold you close, think for a moment of the fire that didn't warm, of the man who watched it die again and again, of the sky that never gave answers, only questions, and feel just for a breath luxury of being still, being safe, being held. Because Billy never had that, not for long, not often, and never without fear. Let your room be his shelter tonight. Let your quiet be his peace. And may the cold stay far from your door. Let your room be his shelter tonight. Let your quiet be his peace. And may the cold stay far from your door. Subsegment 3. Always watching your back, the toll of mistrust. How a life on the run meant no safety, even among strangers. It wasn't the cold that haunted Billy most nights. It wasn't even the hunger or the ache in his feet. It was people, the possibility of people. The whisper of footsteps that weren't your own. The sudden clink of metal, the cough behind the brush. Because in the West, danger didn't always come with a warning. Sometimes it came with a smile. Sometimes it wore a badge. And sometimes it sat beside you, warmed its hands at your fire, and then waited until you closed your eyes. Imagine yourself on the trail, eyes dry with dust, heart heavy from days without conversation. You see a man in the distance. Another drifter, maybe. Or maybe not. You nod. He nods. Nothing more. You don't ask his name. He doesn't offer it. That's the rule. Because names are anchors. And out here, no one wants to be caught. He sits, shares his beans, offers a drink from his canteen. You thank him. You talk about the sky. Maybe about horses. Nothing personal. You don't ask where he's been. He doesn't ask where you're going. It all seems fine until night comes. And when it does, you don't sleep. Not really. You pretend to. You lie still and wait. You listen. You count his breaths. You listen for the shift in his tone, for the pause between movements, for the one sound that means he's reached for something. Because he might be reaching for a blanket, or he might be reaching for steel. This was Billy's world, a world where kindness was currency and trust could get you killed. He learned early that alliances were temporary, that loyalty had a price, and that price was often betrayal, even among those who called themselves friends. Once, he rode with men who laughed with him, bled with him, stood beside him. But when the law came close, those same men scattered. One even pointed the finger. It didn't matter what they'd shared. It didn't matter what Billy had done or hadn't done. What mattered was who could escape first. So Billy stopped sharing, stopped speaking much. He kept to himself, eyes always scanning, back never turned, hands never far from the grip of his revolver. He wasn't just hiding from the law. He was hiding from everyone. Even in towns, he didn't relax. The swing of saloon doors didn't mean welcome. They meant risk. A stranger might recognize him. A sheriff might guess too much. A drunk might start a fight just to see what happened. So he sat in corners, watched reflections in the mirror behind the bar, memorized exits. You see, when you live on the run, every sound becomes a signal. Every silence becomes suspicious. And every face becomes a question you're not sure you want answered. You start to measure people not by what they say, but by how long they hold your gaze, whether their smile reaches their eyes, whether their boots are clean or scuffed, because everything tells a story, and some stories end badly. Even in sleep, there was no safety. Billy slept light, the way an animal does, ready to bolt, to bite, to disappear, one eye open, even if both were closed. Dreams replaced by instincts. And mornings met not with yawns, but with caution. The toll of all this isn't just physical. It changes you. It hollows you out. Makes you question good intentions. Makes you forget softness, forget laughter. It teaches you that survival means suspicion. That every campfire shared is a test. That every handshake hides a threat. Billy was young, but he lived like an old man. Eyes tired, movements measured, voice quiet, not from humility, but from practice, because silence was safer. Words could be used against you, and secrets kept you alive. So tonight, as your doors are locked and the world is held at bay, take a moment to feel what it meant to live without that, to lie down and never truly rest, to meet every person with a question instead of an open hand, to live not just in fear of enemies, but in doubt of friends. Billy did, every night, every town, every trail, until the very end. Rest easy, you're not on the run, not tonight, not ever. It's strange how the stories of the West so often forget the stomach. They remember the shootouts, they remember the dust, they remember the names carved into history. But they rarely remember the ache that starts dull behind the ribs and grows sharper with each passing hour, the quiet hunger that was as much a part of life as the dust on your boots. For Billy the Kid and men like him, food wasn't a matter of taste or timing. It was a question of survival, a quiet calculation made beneath the growl of an empty belly. You woke up hungry, always. No matter how much you managed to find the day before, it was never enough. The desert air seemed to burn through calories just as fast as it burned your skin. And there was no breakfast table waiting, no warm bread, no eggs, no coffee. Just the same question, every morning, what do I eat today? If you were lucky, you still had some jerky. Hard as leather, salty enough to dry your tongue, it took minutes just to chew through one piece. You didn't eat it for flavor. You ate it because it was all you had. If you were even luckier, there were beans cold, canned, and maybe weeks old. You'd spoon them out in the dark, careful to leave enough for tomorrow. Rationing wasn't just smart, it was the difference between fainting on the trail or staying upright. Billy, on the move, didn't have the luxury of restocking often. He couldn't just ride into any town, too many eyes, too many wanted posters. So he foraged when he could. Shot rabbits when luck was kind, drank from streams when he trusted the water. But more often than not, the days were spent with a half-full belly, walking toward hope, toward something that didn't taste like old leather. There were times, of course, when a saloon meal made its way to him, a rare moment of calm. But even then, he ate quickly. Not just because he was hungry, but because he knew he wouldn't be sitting long. A man on the run doesn't savor. He gulps, he swallows fast, he listens for doors, watches for eyes, and always leaves something on the plate, just in case he had to move before the last bite. Hunger makes you smaller, it makes your thoughts sharper, and your movements slower. It changes the way you see the world. Every squirrel becomes potential, every abandoned house becomes hope. Every rustling bush becomes a question, and every hour that passes without a meal becomes a weight not just in your belly, but in your mind. The worst part? It never really goes away. Even when you eat, even when you're full, hunger lingers like mistrust, like cold, like the feeling that the next meal might be the last for a while. Billy's ribs must have shown. His coat hung a little looser each month. His face, young and sharp, likely bore the hollowness of someone always searching, not just for peace, but for calories, for warmth, for the simple act of chewing. And sometimes it wasn't just about finding food, it was about keeping it. You might trade for a loaf of bread, only to have it stolen. You might hunt a rabbit, only to find others hunting you. Because hunger breeds desperation, and desperate men are just as dangerous as any sheriff with a warrant. So Billy learned not to show his hunger. He learned to eat in silence, to carry what he could, and never more, to cook quickly and hide the smell, because the scent of food was an invitation. And invitations out there could kill. You might think you'd do fine, that you'd ration, that you'd plan. But out there, it's different. Plans dissolve in the heat. in the cold, in the wind that scatters your campfire and leaves your beans half-cooked and blown with sand. You'd think about food all the time, even when you tried not to, even when you were talking or walking or waiting. Your body would remind you, again and again. The gunfights, they were rare. The hunger, that was constant. And so, tonight, as you drift to sleep with a full stomach, let yourself notice the absence of that ache. Let yourself feel how extraordinary it is to rest without longing, to lie still without planning the next meal. That is a kind of peace Billy rarely knew. He walked through the dust, ribs aching, lips dry, dreams swallowed by survival, and he kept going. Because he had to. And you get to rest, full, safe, unchased. Good night. Let your belly be warm. Let your heart be light. And let the kid just for tonight know what it feels like to be fed and free. Before the headlines, before the pistol, before the name that would stretch across centuries like the echo of a gunshot was just Henry. A boy with hair the color of sunlit straw and eyes that carried too much question for someone so small. Henry McCarty. Born not into chaos, but into ordinary struggle. A childhood planted in the hard soil of poverty, watered by uncertainty, and grown under the shadow of loss. His beginnings weren't marked by crime or defiance. They were marked by absence. His father gone, no story to chase, no mystery to solve, just gone. And then the mother, Catherine, strong by all accounts, warm. But sickness took her, as it did so many others in those days, and quickly. Consumption, they said. Tuberculosis, now we call it. But back then, it was just the cough that stole your breath, and then your life. When she passed, Henry was 14. But out there, 14 might as well have been grown, old enough to work, old enough to fend, old enough to be alone. Imagine the silence that follows a mother's final breath, the kind that settles into wallpaper, into the corners of rooms, into your bones. No siblings close, no family reaching out. Just Henry, standing on the edge of a new life that no longer had place for a boy. So he drifted, not by choice, but by necessity, from Indiana to Kansas to New Mexico, a ghost moving through border towns and boarding houses, eyes always scanning for someone to see him, to claim him, to give him a roof not just over his head, but over his heart. But the West wasn't kind that way. It wasn't built for boys like Henry. It was built for profit, for land, for men. And so the child became smoke fading through alleys, working odd jobs, stealing not out of rebellion, but out of need. A loaf of bread, a bundle of laundry, nothing more than survival. But the world does not care why a crime is committed, only that it is. And so the boy earned his first arrest, and with it, his first story. He didn't become Billy the Kid all at once. It happened in layers. Henry became William, William became Billy, and the kid, that was how others saw him. Small, quick, slippery. He became legend because no one ever tried to understand the boy behind the eyes, only the hand with the gun. But Billy Henry wanted something simpler than fame. He wanted belonging, somewhere to sleep without checking the door twice. Someone who would call his name with softness, not suspicion, not fear. Every choice he made, every theft, every escape, every shot can be traced back to that ache, that invisible thread tugging him towards safety he never found. He joined gangs not because he craved violence, but because they gave him something close to family. He ran not because he hated the law, but because the law never gave him a chance to be more than a file. And through it all, the child endured. Beneath the growing shadow of outlaw, there was always the lost boy, sitting still some nights, thinking of her, of the woman who once tucked him in, of warmth, of home. We so often look at historical figures through the lens of their worst days, their loudest moments. But what about the quiet ones? The ones spent alone, knees to chest, trying to remember the sound of a voice long silenced. Those moments shaped Billy just as much as the gunfights did, perhaps more. So tonight, let us pause not on the legend, but on the boy, the one who waited, for family, for comfort, for someone to say, "You're safe now." Let your breath slow, let your thoughts drift. And if you feel a small ache in your chest, know that you're touching something true. The heart of a child who never asked to be a story. Sleep easy. Somewhere, maybe, he finally did too. He wasn't born with a gun in his hand. He wasn't raised on revenge or bred for violence. It happened slowly, like dusk bleeding into night. One small turn, one misstep. A series of choices that began as survival and ended in story. After his mother died, Henry wandered, from one dusty town to another, from one job to the next. He delivered messages, cleaned stables, washed dishes, and when work ran out, as it always did for boys like him, he did what he had to. He stole once, maybe twice. Bread, a shirt, nothing worth remembering, but someone did remember. Someone always did. That's how he got his first taste of a cell, just a few nights. Long enough to feel the metal, the insult, the forgetting of your name. When he got out, he didn't feel freer, he felt marked. As if the town had decided he was no longer boy, but burden. So he moved on again. Somewhere new, somewhere he could start fresh. And for a while he did. New name, new face, a little older, a little quieter. But the West was changing. Railroads grew, lawmen multiplied, and the old codes of justice gave way to bureaucracy. Billy didn't mean to step into trouble, but trouble had a way of finding those without shields. He fell in with others like him, not criminals, just drifting boys, outsiders. They shared meals, watched each other's backs, rode together when they could, but the world saw something else. A gang, a threat, and when a petty argument with a blacksmith turned into a struggle, and a struggle turned into a shot, Billy crossed a line. A man lay dead, and Billy was no longer just a boy with a past. He was a fugitive. The law didn't ask questions. The papers didn't wait. They wrote their headlines in bold. Billy the Kid, young, dangerous, wild. It stuck. He couldn't outrun it. Every town he passed through knew the name before he arrived. Every sheriff knew the bounty, and every move he made, every breath he took, was seen through that lens. But the truth was simpler. He ran because they chased him. He fought because they aimed first. He lived in shadows because the world wouldn't let him in the light. His outlawry wasn't a grand plan. It was a corner he was backed into, and in that corner he learned to fight. But he didn't relish the killing, not like the stories say. Most days he avoided it, talked his way out, hid, moved at night. But when the trigger had to be pulled, he pulled it. Not out of malice, but out of the kind of survival no one teaches, the kind you learn when you're very young and very alone. The myth grew, bigger than him, faster than fact, and Billy watched it grow like a shadow he couldn't stop. People whispered about him, told tales in saloons, drew him with eyes that gleamed. But he never asked for it, never signed up to be the kid. He just wanted a place to stop running. So tonight, let the myths sleep. Let the newspaper clippings yellow and fade, and instead, think of a boy with too many names and nowhere to put them. A boy who became a symbol because the world refused to see his truth. Let your body be still. Let your breathing soften. The chase is over. For now, for you, and maybe, just maybe, for him too. There were days when nothing happened, and those are the ones no one talks about. No bullets, no galloping hooves, no bounty posters fluttering in the wind, just stillness, just waiting. Just a boy named Billy, sitting under a patch of shade, hat pulled low, the world stretching wide and quiet around him. These were the spaces between the legend, the parts too small for the stories, but just large enough to hold the truth. You'd find him sometimes near a river, scribbling on scraps of paper with charcoal or an old pencil nub. He wasn't writing confessions, he wasn't drafting threats, just thoughts, letters maybe, to no one in particular. Or maybe to someone long gone, words he didn't say aloud, lines that gave structure to a life that otherwise ran ragged. And sometimes he just sat, for hours, watching the wind move through the grass, watching ants carry grains of sand. The kind of stillness that can only come when there's no place left to go, and no one chasing you for the moment. He wasn't always fleeing. There were windows of calm, slivers of silence that slipped in between the storms. He liked to fix things. Mended a saddle once, not because he had to, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. He was good with them, quiet, capable. Cleaned his guns meticulously. Not out of obsession, but out of habit. Routine was rare, but in the quiet spaces, he built what little of it he could. And then there were the animals. He had a way with them. Horses, especially, they trusted him. Maybe because he didn't demand much from them. He asked for speed when he had to. But mostly, he just kept them fed, watered, spoken to softly. In those moments, when it was just Billy and the horse, or the fire, or the sky, the weight of the world felt further away. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it wasn't the grin of the outlaw. It was a different kind of smile. A remembering, a flicker of something untouched. Maybe from a time before he was chased. Before the name, before the myth. Evenings came slow in those quiet days. The sun didn't fall so much as it sighed into the earth, and Billy would watch. Let the colors change, let the light soften, let the stars find their place. He'd stretch out, maybe hum something low and tuneless, maybe just listen, to the fire crackling, to the insects, to the rhythm of a world that didn't know his name. These were the moments that didn't make the papers, that never filled court documents or ballads, but they mattered, because they were his, because they reminded him he was still a person, not just a fugitive, that he could still be still, that there was a version of him that didn't have to run. So tonight, as the world quiets and your thoughts begin to soften, think of him not as a shadow on the run, but as a boy beneath the stars, resting in the hush of the in-between. And maybe, just maybe, in this moment, he's resting too. It is one thing to be hunted, always on the move, with adrenaline as your compass. It is another entirely to be cornered, trapped, held in place by time itself. And for Billy the Kid, the long days in Lincoln were the most restless of all. Not because of bullets flying or fists raised, but because of the stillness, the slow burn of waiting, the heaviness of dread that seeps in when the next step isn't yours to make. Lincoln, New Mexico, a town like many others in the territory, dusted with heat, rattled by winds, shaped by ambition. But to Billy, it became a holding cell, a last stand, though he hadn't meant it to be. When the Lincoln County War erupted, when sides were drawn and alliances forced, Billy found himself in a house the McSween home barricaded in, surrounded not by the wild, but by lawmen and hired guns, their boots crunching just beyond the walls. Imagine it, a house full of men, each with their own reasons for staying. The windows shuttered, the doors blocked, rifles at the ready, but no one moved. Not really. Days passed. Then more, they whispered. Waited, listened for the telltale snap of a twig, for footsteps on gravel, for voices they knew and feared. Inside, it wasn't courage that kept them steady. It was fatigue, the kind of tired that seeps into your bones when the world forgets to turn. Food ran low, water spoiled, the air inside grew thick, and outside, the heat pounded down without mercy. No one wanted to fire first, but no one dared blink. And all the while, Billy waited, rifle across his knees, eyes always watching, ears trained on each creak, each gust of wind that sounded too much like movement. There were no clocks inside, but they didn't need one. Time passed in the settling of dust, in the stiffening of limbs, in the ache behind the eyes. They read letters again and again, told stories in whispers, slept in shifts, though sleep came poorly. The walls weren't thick enough to keep fear out. They just echoed it back. And Billy? He wasn't the leader, not really. But they looked to him anyway, because he had a calmness that didn't come from age, but from familiarity with fear. He knew how to sit with it, knew how to make it wait alongside him. When the fighting finally came, it wasn't fast. It was fire. Literal fire. Flames licking the walls. Smoke seeping in through the floorboards. And with it, panic. But even then, Billy moved steady, led some out, covered others, escaped not with glory, but with grit. But it was the waiting that haunted him most. Not the chaos, not the escape, but those days before, when he could do nothing but sit and let the hours fold in on themselves. And so, as you lie here now, still and safe, think of those inside that house. Think of the boy with the legend stitched around him like too tight clothes, sitting in a corner, listening to footsteps that never came. Let your breath slow, let your room hold you. Because Billy never had a room that held him. Not in Lincoln, not anywhere. The West was not a place for sentiment, or so the stories say. It was a land of grit, not grace, of rifles, not romance. But behind the dust and the smoke, beyond the badge and the bounty, there were moments of softness hidden like seeds beneath dry earth. And if you listened closely, if you sat long enough by the dying fire, You might have heard them in the scratching of a pencil on torn paper. The letters, the ones never sent. Billy the Kid wrote them. Not many, not often. But sometimes, when the night settled too heavily and the stars seemed more distant than usual, he would reach for a scrap corner of newspaper, the back of a wanted flyer, a page torn from someone else's ledger. He would write not because he expected anyone to read it, but because the act itself was a kind of reaching, a way to speak when no one was listening. The letters weren't confessions, they were glimpses. Half-thoughts, memories, wishes. A note to his mother, perhaps, though she'd long been gone. A line to a brother he might have had, or wished he did. He wrote about the cold, about the taste of bad water, about a dream he'd had the night before, a house with a porch, a garden, someone humming inside. He wrote to imagine himself somewhere else. And he wasn't alone. All across the territories, cowboys and drifters, ranch hands and scouts, they wrote. They carried the ache of isolation like a second heart. And when words failed in speech, they found them on paper. Sentences that trailed off, paragraphs that folded in on themselves, notes tucked into saddlebags and never pulled out again, or buried under rocks, or slipped into the bark of a tree, or burned once the wind changed. Because some words weren't meant to arrive, they were meant to be released. Billy may have never seen a reply, likely never expected one, but still, he wrote, because the hand that held the pen felt, for a moment, like it held something bigger than iron, something closer to the boy he had once been. And so tonight, as your mind slows and the darkness deepens, picture him, not the outlaw, not the gunman, but the writer, the dreamer. The boy leaning against a tree stump, pencil in hand, scribbling thoughts into the hush of desert air. The letter might still be out there, lost to wind, or waiting, tucked between rocks, faded by time, but its meaning remains. A longing, a whisper, a hope. And maybe that's all any of us are really trying to send. The stars were always there, though they never quite looked the same from one camp to the next. They were the only roof Billy the Kid ever truly knew. Unchanging, yet never familiar. Their quiet shimmer offered no comfort, but they filled the silence when words had run out. Long after the fire had died down, and the chill had begun its slow creep into his bones, Billy would tilt his head back and stare upward. Not in awe, not in search of answers. Just to remind himself he was still there. Still part of something bigger. He wasn't alone in this ritual. Across the West, from Texas brushlands to New Mexico's stony deserts, cowboys looked skyward in the hush between days. It was the one moment they didn't have to run, didn't have to pretend. The night sky didn't judge, didn't chase, it just watched. And in that watching there was stillness, a soft thread of connection. Billy had no telescope, no charts. He didn't know the names of most constellations, but he recognized them by their patterns. The crooked belt, the crooked W, the line of stars that always pointed north. He didn't need names, he needed rhythm, familiarity, a map of light when everything else felt too dark. Sometimes he'd talk to the stars not loudly, but under breath. Little murmurs, a question asked, a name repeated, a joke said aloud to no one, just to hear his own voice after so much silence. There was a strange intimacy in those moments. The vastness above made him feel small, but not lost. Small in a way that let the weight fall off his shoulders, if only for a while. The stars held every version of him, the child, the outlaw, the dreamer. They bore witness when no one else did. And as he lay back on the hard ground, arms folded behind his head, he let the sky soak into his thoughts. He counted not sheep but stars. Not to sleep, but to remember that he could. No one tells you how important it is to look up when your whole life has been spent watching your back. But for Billy, those brief upward glances were survival of another kind. They tethered him to something beyond the chase, beyond the myth, beyond even memory. So as you lie beneath your own ceiling, be it of plaster or wood or city light, imagine a sky stretched wide above a boy with too many names and nowhere to go. Imagine him there, quiet, steady, eyes fixed on constellations that never wrote about him but always watched. Maybe tonight they still do. The desert does something to the mind, especially when the sun dips and shadows stretch long across the earth. It hums with a quiet oldness, like it remembers things no one else does. Men who had seen bullets fly and friends fallen who scoffed at preachers and sneered at promises still looked over their shoulders when the wind began to whisper. Even Billy, maybe especially Billy. You'd think a man living by the gun wouldn't leave space in his head for ghosts. But the West was full of them, and the silence of the desert was never truly empty. There were sounds that didn't belong to animals, shimmers in the heat that didn't fade when the air cooled, tracks that ended without reason, bones dug up where no one claimed the land. Stories passed from one campfire to the next quiet, half laughed, but never quite dismissed. Billy had heard them all, the woman in white who wept along the Rio Grande, the black dog that trailed you only when you were near your end, the lights that floated above the dry hills, never close, never far, just watching, and the wind that sometimes carried your own name back to you, not as an echo, but as a warning. He didn't speak of them often, no one did, but they showed in the way he built his camps, always just outside the trees, never too close to a dry riverbed, never under a full moon if he could help it. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe instinct passed down through people who knew that land long before he did. The Apache, the Comanche, the old trailmen who buried their dead facing east and never whistled after sunset. And there were signs. You learn them out there. Birds flying low before dawn, a coyote that stops and stares too long, a fire that won't light on the first try. Little things that meant nothing unless they meant everything. Even men who carried guns slept with charms tied to their belts. A stone with a hole in it, a feather from a hawk, a coin bent in half. Billy wasn't immune to these things. Maybe he didn't believe outright, but he respected them. The same way you respect an old road by not asking too many questions about who built it or why it always seems to lead you back. And when he rode through certain stretches of desert, he'd sometimes go quiet. Not because he was tired, but because something in the land asked him to listen. So tonight, as the wind brushes your window or rustles outside your door, think of that boy listening in the dark. Not for enemies, not for lawmen, but for something older. Something that belonged not to men, but to the land itself. Let that whisper pass through you. Let it say nothing. Let it say everything. And sleep, knowing that not every fear has to be understood to be respected. Not every shadow is dangerous, but some are worth watching. Silence in the desert is not empty. It is full not of noise, but of weight. It carries the breath of the past, the hush of 100 forgotten footsteps, the soft brushing of dust against worn boots and dry cloth. It has texture, it moves, and it speaks, though not with words. For Billy, and for all who crossed that land, silence was a companion as constant as the sun. You wouldn't hear it at first. Not over the creak of leather or the jangle of a saddle, but as those faded, as the horse slowed or the fire crackled to a whisper, the sound of the dust rose up. It rustled, it shifted, it settled. The tiniest movements, the wind catching loose grains, the crunch beneath a footstep became a kind of music, a rhythm that belonged only to that place. Billy came to know its song well. He listened for it, trusted it more than voices, more than maps. The way the dust moved could tell you if someone had passed before you. The way it lay could reveal how long ago they'd gone. In this way, the land was always telling stories. Quiet ones, slow ones, but honest. You just had to know how to listen. There were moments when Billy would stop walking, just to hear it. Not because he was tired, but because the dust had shifted strangely, or because the stillness had grown too deep. He would crouch low, hand to earth, eyes scanning the horizon. Not for enemies, but for patterns. The land always left hints, little signs of what had come and what might follow. And in those moments, the silence pressed in, not cruelly, not with fear, but with a kind of reverence, the way a cathedral hushes as a prayer begins. The desert silence asked for respect, demanded presence. It carved away distraction and left only truth. That silence shaped Billy more than any man did. It taught him patience, taught him humility. In towns, he had to be quick, sharp, but in the wild, he had to be still, thoughtful. The desert did not reward noise, it swallowed it, and it remembered those who listened. So tonight, as your own world quiets, try to hear the sound of dust, not with your ears, but with your imagination. Picture the hush of an open plain, the slow sigh of wind over stone, the long breath between stars, and somewhere in that quiet picture, Billy, alone, not lonely, listening, not for trouble, but for the land. and let that silence carry you gently into sleep. Not all stories in the West were carved in dust. Some were etched in marble. While Billy and men like him slept beneath stars and stitched their thoughts into scraps of paper, others lived in rooms so grand, even their silences echoed differently. The mansions of the rail barons rose like stone dreams on the edge of prairie townswide porches, stained glass windows, and rugs brought in from the east, where winters were softer and wealth came with a name. The contrast was staggering, a world of silver cutlery and velvet curtains, standing just miles from brush-covered badlands where a man could go days without seeing another face. These were homes built not by hands hardened by rains, but by capital, by contracts, by the unshakable force of industry. Men who never drew a pistol in their lives, yet wielded more power with the stroke of a pen than any gunslinger ever could. Billy must have passed near such places, maybe even saw them from afar, their roofs gleaming in the high sun, their lawns green, impossibly green tended by workers who never owned the land they touched. And perhaps he wondered, if only for a moment, what it would feel like to sit at a table without watching the door, to eat a meal that wasn't rationed, to speak freely, knowing your words wouldn't be turned against you. Inside those houses, the air was different, cooler, perfumed, quiet, but not with caution, with comfort. Every need anticipated. Servants came and went. Clocks ticked softly, and newspapers arrived fresh, bearing stories of distant battles and rising markets, never quite touching the truth of the land they overlooked. It's easy to forget that such wealth lived side by side with struggle, that while Billy patched his boots with scraps of hide, a rail magnate might have been selecting cufflinks from a velvet box. That while one boy wondered if he'd make it through the night, another man wondered which champagne to serve with dinner. But the walls of those mansions weren't immune to silence. They had their own kind, the muffled tension of deals struck in secret, the brittle laughter of guests trying too hard. And sometimes, behind thick curtains, even the wealthy looked out at the horizon and saw not security, but the great unknown. So as you lie in your own quiet tonight, know that comfort is not always the absence of hardship, and hardship is not always loud. Let the stillness remind you of the strange symmetry of the world Billy moved through, where some lived with too much, and others carried nothing but the weight of the stars. And yet, both looked out on the same sky. At the edge of town, always under glowing lamps and painted signs, the saloons stood like beacons. Light spilled from their windows, laughter drifted into the street, and piano keys danced beneath the noise of boots and glass. Inside, the tables were crowded with men, not just from the town, but from faraway places: cattle barons, railroad agents, hired guns on leave, and gamblers with fingers that shuffled cards better than they held a gun. The room pulsed with a kind of energy that belonged nowhere else in the West, a temporary theater of wealth and escape. And just outside, only steps from the door, men like Billy sat chewing old jerky, wondering how they might stretch the last coin in their pocket to cover a meal, a saddle repair, and the long road ahead. The irony didn't sting anymore, not after the first few times. It simply settled in the gut like hunger itself. A reminder that the world was split, not by good and evil, but by luck and access. The saloons were where stories were spun, where drinks flowed as if water weren't scarce, where some men laughed so hard it echoed down the boardwalk. But their laughter was rarely pure. It was laced with desperation, with denial, with the unspoken truth that even gold could vanish with one unlucky turn of a card. And still, they played. Still, they poured. Billy sometimes walked past them, quiet, unnoticed. Or he'd stand in the doorway a moment, the light warming his dust-covered boots, before stepping back into the dark. He had no use for games of chance. His life was already won, and he knew better than to gamble with what little he had. Inside, the saloon girl's voice wove through cigar smoke and whiskey breath, gentle songs to no one in particular, and men, lonely in their wealth or their want, nodded and tipped their hats. It was a world built on illusion. You could forget the desert in there, forget the heat, forget the cold, but only until you stepped outside again. And outside, the bread was still stale, the coffee boiled too long, the trail stretched endlessly. For every man buying rounds in the saloon, there were a dozen more sleeping under wagons, their stomachs tight with emptiness. Billy didn't envy them. He didn't curse them. He simply saw them, knew that their world and his weren't divided by character, but by circumstance. And that truth kept him grounded, kept him quiet. So tonight, as you rest in a space of comfort, think of the boy who walked past warm rooms and full bellies, who chose silence over show, and let your heart soften, not in pity, but in perspective. Because behind every saloon door, there was a man trying to forget, and outside it, someone remembering too much. Justice in the West was supposed to be swift, clear, and blind. The kind sung about in ballads and printed in papers where sheriffs wore white hats and wrongs were righted at high noon. But beneath the dust and the declarations lay something quieter, colder, and far more familiar. A system not of fairness, but of favor. And if you had money, land, or the ear of the right man in town, the rules bent like a branch in a dry wind. Billy the Kid saw it early. He didn't have lawmen on his side. He didn't have land to protect or a business to back him. He had speed, reputation, and too many eyes watching from the shadows. The courtrooms he entered weren't built for boys like him. They were built to protect property, not people, especially not people who lived in the dust. In towns across the territory, the same pattern repeated. A rancher with wealth might settle a dispute with a handshake, a quiet word behind a closed door. A businessman's son could find his way out of a charge, escorted home instead of to a cell. But a boy who stole to eat, he'd find himself behind bars before sunset, and if he ran, he was marked forever. An outlaw, a threat. Billy wasn't innocent, but neither was the system that chased him. He knew of men who committed worse and walked free, men who hid behind paper and politics, men whose power came not from the barrel of a gun, but from signatures on deeds and banknotes folded into pockets that never saw dirt. When Billy stood before a judge, it wasn't a moment of reckoning, it was a formality. The outcome already scribbled on someone's ledger, long before he ever opened his mouth. He wasn't asked for his story. He was reminded of his name and all the things they said it stood for. And when he escaped, time and time again, it wasn't to defy justice, it was to escape injustice, to find air where there was none. He knew the game, knew which lawyers belonged to which families, knew which marshals took bribes, which deputies looked the other way when the man wearing cuffs had friends in silver-trimmed waistcoats. Billy's crimes were recorded in ink, but theirs disappeared like smoke. The newspapers fed the fire. They needed villains, and Billy's face sold papers. They printed half-truths, borrowed stories from each other, gave voice to those who'd never spoken to him. The rich didn't have to worry about that. They had their names protected by distance, and their actions shielded by influence. The more powerful the man, the shorter the memory of his mistakes. So Billy ran, not always from guilt, but from being caught in a story he didn't write. And with every mile, he carried not just his name, but the weight of a world tilted. Tonight, in your own world of balance and comfort, consider that justice, real justice, isn't just about laws. It's about who those laws were written for. Billy lived in the space between lines. And when the line curved for others and stayed straight for him, he did what anyone might do. He kept moving. He kept surviving. He kept hoping, perhaps, that someday fairness would ride as fast as he did. Billy's last days, viewed from afar by men with offices, cigars, and no need to run. He died as he lived surrounded, not by ceremony, but by the quiet indifference of a system that had already decided who he was. Billy the Kid's final days were not filled with chaos, not bursting with glory. They were quiet, measured, and viewed through the smoke of cigars from men who never once slept under open sky. In the final days before the shot, before the room with dim lamplight and a deputy's bullet, there were others watching. Men with gold chains straining across rounded stomachs. Men with oil lamps flickering gently on polished desks. They sat in Santa Fe, in Albuquerque, in offices where their boots never touched dust, and where danger lived only in stories told secondhand. And from their distance, they judged. They read the papers. They shook their heads. They puffed smoke and discussed justice like it was a parlor game. To them, Billy was an inconvenience. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he symbolized. Disorder, rebellion. A reminder that the land wasn't fully theirs yet. That there were still parts of the map where laws didn't hold, and names couldn't be erased by a gavel alone. They wanted him gone, not silenced, just removed. Swept aside like ash from the end of a cigar. They did not feel the wind that bent the trees where Billy hid. They did not know the pain of crouching behind cold rocks, breath caught in the chest. They did not walk with blisters or live on jerky. But they made decisions just the same. They handed out rewards, approved deputies, wrote letters that sealed a boy's fate. And Billy, for his part, kept going. He dodged, he hid, he smiled sometimes. Not because he was winning, but because the absurdity of it all had grown so thick it was almost funny. The chase, the myth, the machinery behind it, all so far removed from the dirt under his nails. He knew they would get him eventually. Everyone did. Not because he deserved it, but because they needed it. A conclusion, a headline, an ending to write down. When Pat Garrett pulled the trigger, he ended more than a life. He closed a chapter that had been written by men who never met the boy at its center. And as word spread, those same men in waistcoats nodded over their brandy. Order, they said, had been restored. But the land did not notice. The stars kept on shining, the dust kept on blowing, and somewhere, a coyote cried out not in mourning, but in rhythm, as if the world continued, untouched by the ending of a name. Tonight, as you rest in your safe place, consider the distance between power and truth, between those who decide and those who are decided upon. Billy didn't ride to change the world, but the world changed to remove him. And in that, perhaps, lies the most human story of all. So breathe deeply. Let the silence fall around you like a blanket. And remember, not the outlaw, but the boy in the shadows. Watching the lights from the houses he'd never enter. Listening for footsteps that would not stop. And knowing somehow that his time was near. And now the trail grows quiet. The footsteps that echoed across the hard-packed earth have faded into stillness. The stars hang high, unblinking, their silent glow spilling gently across the open spaces once crossed by a restless boy. Billy the Kid is gone. But not forgotten, not truly. Not in the way stories fade when they're finished, or in the way names are buried under dust and stone. He lingers not as a figure of rebellion or infamy, but as a presence softer, quieter, more human than the headlines ever allowed. His was not a life of noise, though the world painted it that way. It was a life of silence-long, lonely silences that stretched across desert nights and through narrow canyons of thought. What remains is softer than the myth. It is not the sound of a bullet, or the flare of violence, or the thrill of the chase. It is the memory of a child with no place to call home. The quiet shuffle of boots that moved not toward glory, but away from sorrow. A boy who wrote letters never sent, who watched the stars not to navigate, but to feel a little less alone. A boy who looked over his shoulder not out of guilt, but habit, who moved through the world like a shadow cast before dawnreal, but rarely seen for what he truly was. You've walked beside him now, through the dust, through the cold, through silence so thick it pressed into the bones. You've stood where he stood in the hush, between breath and fear, in the aching stillness of waiting for something you can't name. You've felt his hunger, heard his breath catch in moments of stillness, watched him run, not because he loved the chase, but because it was the only direction left to move, not toward something better, but away from something worse. And maybe, just maybe, you've seen something of yourself in that reflection. A longing for peace, for a name spoken without suspicion, for a night without fear. The desire to sit still, to be seen, to be held by something more forgiving than law or luck. The need for a story that isn't told through others' mouths, but through the quiet you carry with you. Because that's the truth of it, isn't it? For all his movement, Billy was waiting, for belonging, for stillness, for the comfort of a home that didn't vanish when the wind changed. His life, so often described in quick flashes, was made mostly of pauses, of looking out across empty land and wondering where it might end, of sharing a fire with no one, of dreaming, not in grand visions, but in fragments of warm meal, a soft voice, a door that didn't slam shut. Tonight, let the desert grow still, let the fire burn low, let the wind die down. There is no more running, not here, not now. The boots are off, the weapons are quiet, and the dust has finally settled. Billy doesn't need to hide anymore, and neither do you. Let your breath slow, let your shoulders soften, let your thoughts settle like dust after thunder, like silence after sorrow, like the end of a story told not with exclamation, but with a whisper. Because the story has ended, and so has the chase. And in this moment, you are safe, just as he wished to be. No sheriffs, no headlines, no eyes watching from behind curtains. Just the night, just the hush, just the stars. Sleep now, with the stars above you and the truth beside you. Not the legend, not the outlaw, just the boy, just Billy. Good night.